Captain Elena Rodriguez stood on the deck of the research vessel Deep Explorer, watching the sonar screens with growing excitement. For 3 days, her team had been scanning the deepest part of the Mariana Trench, looking for a lost submarine from World War II. Instead, they found something that should not exist. "Captain, you need to see this," called Dr. Marcus Webb, the lead sonar operator. His voice carried a strange mix of confusion and wonder. Elena walked over to his station and looked at the display. What she saw made her heart race. The sonar showed a massive object buried under thousands of years of mud and sand. It was huge, at least as big as a city block. But size was not what made Elena's hands shake. The object had perfect geometric shapes, straight lines, perfect circles, and angles that nature could never create. "How deep is it buried?" Elena asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "About 200 feet under the sediment, Captain. And it's sitting on the ocean floor at almost 7 miles deep. The pressure down there would crush any human-made object from our time." Elena stared at the screen. The object looked like a building, or maybe a ship. But no human technology could survive at that depth for very long. And the sonar readings showed it had been there for a very, very long time. "Run another scan. Make sure this is real." The team ran the scan 3 more times. Each time, the results were the same. Something artificial and enormous was sitting at the bottom of the deepest part of Earth's oceans. Within hours, word of the discovery spread. Elena tried to keep it secret, but too many people had seen the sonar readings. By the next morning, satellite phones were ringing constantly. Government officials, scientists, and military commanders all wanted to know what the Deep Explorer had found. The United Nations called an emergency meeting. Representatives from every major nation flew to New York to discuss what should be done. Some countries wanted to claim the object for themselves. Others argued it belonged to all humanity. The debates grew heated, but everyone agreed on one thing: they had to bring it to the surface. Admiral Sarah Chen of the U.S. Navy was put in charge of the recovery operation. She had overseen many difficult salvage missions, but nothing like this. The object was deeper than any previous recovery, larger than anything ever raised from the ocean floor, and made of materials that their instruments could not identify. "We're going to need help," Admiral Chen told Elena during their first meeting. "Every major navy in the world is sending ships. The Russians have their best deep-sea equipment. The Japanese are bringing their most advanced robotics. Even countries that usually don't work together are sending their best people and technology." Elena had never seen so many ships in one place. The international fleet grew larger each day. Research vessels, military ships, supply boats, and floating cranes arrived from around the world. The ocean above the discovery site looked like a floating city. The work began slowly. First, they had to remove the sediment that covered the object. Special underwater robots were lowered 7 miles down to the ocean floor. These robots used water jets and vacuum systems to carefully blow away thousands of years of mud and sand. As more of the object became visible, the excitement on the ships above grew stronger. It was definitely artificial. The hull had a smooth, metallic surface that showed no signs of corrosion, despite being underwater for so long. Strange symbols covered parts of the surface. They looked almost like writing. But no human language had ever used symbols like these. Dr. Lisa Park, an archaeologist from Oxford University, studied the photographs sent up by the underwater robots. "These symbols," she told Elena, "they don't match anything in human history. Not Egyptian hieroglyphs, not Chinese characters, not any ancient writing system I've ever seen." The symbols seemed to move when people looked at them closely. Not actually moving, but creating an optical illusion that made them appear to shift and flow like liquid metal. After 2 months of careful excavation, the full size of the object became clear. It was a spacecraft. There was no doubt about it. The design was unlike anything humans had ever built. but it was clearly meant to travel through space. It had what looked like engine ports, viewing windows, and docking bays. The next challenge was lifting it. The spacecraft weighed thousands of tons and sat 7 miles underwater. The pressure at that depth could crush a nuclear submarine like an empty can. Engineers from 12 different countries worked together to design a lifting system. They used a combination of powerful winches, inflatable balloons, and flotation devices. Everything had to be tested and retested. One mistake could destroy the spacecraft and waste years of work. The lifting operation took another 3 months. Every day, the spacecraft rose a few hundred feet. Cameras mounted on the lifting equipment sent back live footage. People around the world watched on television as humanity's greatest discovery slowly emerged from the deepest part of the ocean. When the spacecraft finally broke the surface, a cheer went up from every ship in the international fleet. Sailors, scientists, and government officials from dozens of countries celebrated together. They had accomplished something that seemed impossible just a year before. The spacecraft was carefully towed to a specially built dry dock in the Philippines. The facility had been constructed in secret while the lifting operation was taking place. It was designed to hold the enormous craft while teams of experts studied it. As Elena stood on the dock, looking at the spacecraft for the first time in daylight, she felt a mixture of pride and fear. Pride because humanity had worked together to achieve something amazing. Fear because they had no idea what they had really found. The spacecraft's hull gleamed in the sunlight despite being underwater for so long. The strange symbols were even more mysterious when seen up close. They seemed to pulse with their own inner light, though no instruments could detect any energy coming from them. "What do you think is inside?" Elena asked Admiral Chen. The admiral stared at the massive craft. "But I have a feeling that whatever it is, it's going to change everything." Elena nodded. She had the same feeling. Humanity had found something that was not supposed to exist, and soon they would open it up and discover what secrets it held. Dr. James Chen had been staring at the alien symbols for 6 weeks. His eyes hurt, his back ached from hunching over computer screens, and he had barely slept. But he was close to understanding something that no human had ever understood before. The spacecraft sat in the massive dry dock facility like a sleeping giant. Teams of scientists worked around it day and night. They took measurements, ran tests, and tried to figure out how old it was. The results shocked everyone. 50,000 years, announced Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the lead carbon dating specialist. Give or take a few thousand years. This thing was sitting on the ocean floor before humans built their first cities. The age of the spacecraft made everyone nervous. If aliens had visited Earth 50,000 years ago, what had happened to them? Why had they never come back? And most importantly, were they still out there somewhere? James was part of a team trying to decode the alien writing. Unlike human languages, these symbols seemed to change depending on who was looking at them and from what angle. Sometimes a symbol that looked like a circle would appear to be a triangle when viewed from a different position. "I think I'm starting to understand," James told his team during one of their daily meetings. "These aren't just symbols. They're 3-dimensional, maybe even 4-dimensional. Each symbol contains multiple layers of meaning." Dr. Elena Vasquez, a mathematician from Spain, looked up from her calculations. "That would explain why they seem to move. Our brains are trying to process information that exists in more dimensions than we're used to." The breakthrough came when James realized that the symbols weren't meant to be read like human writing. They were meant to be felt. When he placed his hand near certain symbols, he could sense their meaning in his mind. It was like the symbols were directly communicating with his brain. "The ship calls itself Seed Keeper," James announced to the assembled team. His voice was full of wonder and a little fear. "And the beings who bait it called themselves the Eternal Gardeners." Using this new understanding, James began to piece together the story of the spacecraft. The Eternal Gardeners were an ancient race that traveled between stars. They didn't conquer planets or steal resources. Instead, they studied life. They collected samples of plants, animals, and intelligent species from across the galaxy. They were scientists, James explained to Admiral Chen during a briefing. Explorers and researchers. This ship was like a flying laboratory and museum. The team found what looked like an airlock on the side of the spacecraft. The door was covered with warning symbols that James could now partially understand. The warnings weren't about danger to humans. They were about preserving what was inside. The ship is sealed to protect its contents, James translated. Whatever is in there, the gardeners wanted to make sure it stayed exactly the way they left it. Opening the airlock became the next challenge. Human technology couldn't cut through the alien metal. Diamond saws broke. Laser cutters had no effect. Even explosives couldn't scratch the surface. The answer came from studying the symbols around the airlock. Dr. Park realized that they weren't just decorations. They were instructions. The door was meant to be opened by someone who could understand the gardener language. James spent days studying the symbols around the airlock. Slowly, he began to understand what they were asking for. The door required a specific sequence of touches in the right places and the right order. It's like a combination lock, James explained to the watching crowd of scientists and officials. But instead of numbers, it uses concepts. I have to touch the symbols in the order that tells a story. The story the door wanted was simple but profound. It was about the cycle of life, birth, growth, learning, teaching, and finally, giving back to help the next generation. James touched each symbol that represented these concepts, following the pattern he had learned. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the symbols around the airlock began to glow with a soft blue light. A low humming sound came from deep within the spacecraft. After 50,000 years of silence, the alien ship was waking up. The airlock opened with a soft hiss of escaping gas. The air that came out was not the stale, dead air they expected. It smelled fresh, like a forest after rain. Instruments showed that it was perfectly breathable for humans. The first team to enter the spacecraft included James, Admiral Chen, Dr. Park, and Elena Rodriguez. They wore full protective suits, despite the clean air readings. No one knew what they might find inside an alien ship that was older than human civilization. The interior of the spacecraft was nothing like the cramped mechanical spaces of human ships. The corridors were wide and curved, with walls that seemed to glow with their own inner light. There were no sharp corners or harsh edges. Everything flowed together like it had been grown rather than built. "It's beautiful," whispered Dr. Park, her voice full of awe. The team moved deeper into the ship. They found rooms that were clearly laboratories, but the equipment was unlike anything humans had ever imagined. Strange devices floated in the air without any visible support. Screens showed information in the flowing alien symbols, updating constantly, even though the ship had been underwater for 50,000 years. In the center of the ship, they found the most incredible room of all. It was enormous, with walls that seemed to stretch up forever. The space was filled with thousands of containers, each one glowing with its own light. "It's an archive," James said, reading the symbols that covered the walls. "A biological and cultural archive. Each container holds samples and information about a different species." The team split up to explore the archive. Dr. Park found containers with samples of plants that looked like nothing on Earth. Elena discovered records of civilizations that had built cities among the stars. James found mathematical formulas that human scientists had never imagined. But it was Dr. Mitchell who made the discovery that changed everything. In a section of the archive labeled with symbols that James translated as local specimens, she found a container marked with symbols that made James's blood run cold. Mitchell asked, pointing at the symbols on the container. James stared at the symbols, checking his translation 3 times to make sure he was reading them correctly. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. It says humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, local primitive species with unusual potential. The container held samples of human DNA, human artifacts, and detailed records of human culture. But according to the dates James could translate from the Gardner records, these samples were over 200,000 years old. That's impossible, Dr. Mitchell said. Humans weren't even fully evolved 200,000 years ago. We were still living in caves. James continued reading the alien records. The more he translated, the more confused and frightened he became. According to the Gardner files, humans had once been an advanced spacefaring species. They had built cities on 100 different worlds, and created technology that even the Gardners admired. But something had happened. Something the Gardner records called the Great Forgetting. In the space of just a few thousand years, human civilization had collapsed completely. Not destroyed by war or disaster, but somehow erased from existence and memory. The Gardners were studying us, James told the assembled team. They were trying to understand how an entire species could lose everything they had built and become primitive again. As the team continued to explore the archive, they found more questions than answers. The spacecraft was filled with records of thousands of species, but humans were the only ones the Gardners had labeled as having forgotten their own civilization. The most disturbing discovery came in the ship's final logs. The Eternal Gardners had left Earth in a hurry. Their last entries spoke of something terrible approaching, something they called the harvest. They had taken their samples and fled, leaving behind their research station to study what would happen to the humans who remained. Admiral Chen called for a full evacuation of the spacecraft, while experts analyzed what they had found. As the team prepared to leave, James took one last look at the glowing archive. Somewhere in this alien museum was the answer to humanity's greatest mystery, who they really were and what they had lost. But James had a growing fear that some knowledge came with a terrible price. The Eternal Gardners had run from something called the harvest. And now, 50,000 years later, humans had found their abandoned research station and awakened systems that had been sleeping on the ocean floor. James couldn't shake the feeling that by opening this door, humanity had announced their presence to something that had been looking for them for a very long time. Dr. Sarah Okafor had spent her entire career studying human genetics. She thought she knew everything there was to know about human DNA. She was wrong. The samples in the Eternal Gardner archive changed everything she believed about humanity. The alien records showed humans not as primitive cave dwellers, but as masters of technology that could reshape matter at the atomic level. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a holographic display that showed ancient human DNA. The team had figured out how to operate some of the Gardner technology, and the results were shocking. This DNA is definitely human, but it's different from modern human DNA. James Chen leaned over her shoulder to study the display. After weeks of translating Gardner records, he was exhausted but fascinated. What kind of different? There are sequences here that don't exist in modern humans. Complex genetic codes that seem designed for enhanced brain function, spatial reasoning, and something the Gardner notes describe as quantum consciousness. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the mathematician, looked up from her work translating technical specifications. Quantum consciousness? What does that even mean? Sarah manipulated the holographic display to show a comparison between ancient and modern human DNA. According to these records, ancient humans could perceive and manipulate reality at the quantum level. They could understand concepts that required massive computers to calculate. They could think in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The archive contained thousands of records about ancient human civilization. Videos showed cities that floated in space, connected by bridges of pure energy. Humans worked alongside artificial intelligences that looked like flowing liquid metal. They had mastered faster-than-light travel and could terraform planets in decades instead of centuries. "This is impossible," Admiral Chen said during one of the daily briefings. "If humans were this advanced, where did it all go? Why don't we have any record of this civilization?" James had been wondering the same thing. The Gardner records provided some clues, but they raised more questions than they answered. The Gardners called it the Great Forgetting. They documented how human civilization collapsed over a period of about 5,000 years, starting around 200,000 years ago. "But collapsed how?" asked Dr. Park. "War, natural disaster, disease?" "None of those," James said, checking his translations again. "According to the Gardner observations, humans deliberately destroyed their own civilization. They erased their cities, destroyed their technology, and somehow removed all memory of what they had built." The idea of an entire species choosing to forget their own achievements seemed crazy, but the evidence was overwhelming. The Gardner archive contained detailed observations of the process, recorded by confused alien scientists who couldn't understand what they were seeing. Sarah made the breakthrough while studying tissue samples from the ancient humans. She was comparing them to DNA from modern humans when she noticed something strange. "The genetic sequences aren't gone," she announced to the team. "They're still there, but they're turned off." She showed them her analysis on the main display screen. Modern human DNA contained all the same complex sequences found in the ancient samples. But in modern humans, these sequences were dormant, suppressed by what looked like genetic switches. "It's like someone went through the human genome and flipped off all the switches that made us special," Sarah explained. "The capability is still there. It's just sleeping." Dr. Vasquez studied the genetic data with growing excitement. "This explains so many things about human behavior that never made sense. Why do humans have an instinctive understanding of mathematical concepts that they've never learned? Why can some people visualize complex three-dimensional structures in their heads? Why do children sometimes seem to know things they couldn't possibly have learned?" The team began testing Sarah's theory on volunteers from the research staff. Using non-invasive scanners, they examined the DNA of everyone working on the project. The results were consistent. Every human they tested carried the dormant genetic sequences. Every human alive today has the genetic potential to think like the ancients did. The ability is just switched off. But the most disturbing discovery came when Sarah studied how the genetic switches worked. They weren't natural mutations. They had been deliberately engineered using technology more advanced than anything humans possess today. "Someone or something modified human DNA," Sarah announced during an emergency meeting of the project leaders. This wasn't evolution. This was intentional genetic engineering on a species-wide scale. James found references to the genetic modification in the Gardner records. The entries were fragmentary and filled with terms he couldn't translate, but the basic story was clear. Ancient humans had modified their own genetics as part of their response to something called the harvest. The Gardners mention a cosmic entity, James explained, something that traveled between star systems, consuming advanced civilizations. They called it the harvest because it gathered up all the intelligence and technology from the species it encountered. According to the alien records, the harvest was attracted to advanced civilizations by their electromagnetic signatures. The more advanced the species became, the brighter they appeared to the harvest's senses. So the ancient humans made themselves appear primitive, Dr. Park said, beginning to understand. They turned off their own intelligence to hide from this cosmic predator. But that's not all, James continued. The genetic modifications weren't just about hiding, they were about evolving. The Gardner records suggest that ancient humans believed they could become something that the harvest couldn't consume, but only if they were willing to sacrifice everything they had built. Sarah's analysis of the genetic switches revealed their true complexity. They weren't just simple on-off controls. They were sophisticated programs designed to activate under specific conditions. These switches respond to neural patterns, environmental stimuli, and social pressures, Sarah explained. It's like ancient humans programmed their own DNA to wake up when their descendants were ready. Dr. Vasquez had been working on mathematical models based on the Gardner data. Her calculations suggested that the genetic modification was even more sophisticated than they had realized. The switches aren't random, she announced. They're designed to activate in a cascade effect. When enough humans begin to awaken their dormant abilities, it triggers the awakening in others. Eventually, the entire species undergoes rapid evolutionary change. The implications were staggering. If Sarah and Elena were correct, humanity was carrying within their own DNA the blueprint for a transformation that their ancestors had planned 200,000 years ago. But the Gardner records contained warnings. The ancient humans had left messages for their descendants, encoded in the genetic switches themselves. James worked day and night to translate these messages, and what he found terrified him. The awakening process can't be stopped once it begins, James told the assembled team. And according to the ancient human records, the genetic modifications were designed to activate when humanity reached a certain level of technological development. Dr. Park looked around the room at all the advanced equipment they were using to study the alien archive. You mean like the ability to raise a 50,000-year-old spacecraft from the bottom of the ocean and decode alien languages? The ancient humans built the awakening protocol to trigger when their descendants proved they were ready to face the harvest. By finding and opening this archive, we may have already started a process that we can't control. Sarah ran more tests on the research team volunteers. The results confirmed their worst fears. Everyone who had spent significant time in the alien archive was showing signs of genetic activation. The dormant sequences in their DNA were beginning to wake up. How long do we have? Admiral Chen asked. Sarah looked at her data again, hoping she had made a mistake. She hadn't. Based on the rate of change I'm seeing, the cascade effect will begin within weeks. Once it starts spreading to the general population, the entire human species will be transformed within a year. They had made the greatest discovery in human history, but they had also triggered an irreversible change that would affect every person on Earth. James continued translating the ancient human messages, desperate to find more information about what was coming. The records spoke of abilities that seemed like magic, the power to manipulate matter with thought, to perceive events across vast distances of space and time, and to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions. But they also spoke of the harvest, an entity that had consumed thousands of civilizations across millions of years, something that was drawn to the electromagnetic signature of awakened consciousness like a moth to flame. Our ancestors hid for 200,000 years, James said quietly. But now we're about to light a beacon that will be visible across the galaxy. Sarah looked at the genetic data on her screens. The awakening had begun, and there was no way to stop it. Humanity was about to discover what they really were. The question was whether they would be ready for what came looking for them. The first sign that something had gone wrong came at 3:47 a.m. local time, when every seismograph on Earth registered the same impossible reading. The planet itself was humming. Dr. Sarah Okafor was in the archive lab when the alien technology suddenly activated on its own. Screens that had been dark for 50,000 years began glowing with cascading symbols. The air itself seemed to vibrate with energy. "James," Sarah called out, "you need to see this." James Chen ran into the lab, still wearing his pajamas. He had been sleeping in the facility for weeks, working around the clock to translate the ancient records. What he saw made his blood freeze. Every display in the archive was active. Information was flowing through systems at incredible speed, as if the alien ship was downloading and uploading massive amounts of data. But to where? "What's it doing?" Sarah asked, watching symbols flash across dozens of screens faster than her eyes could follow. James studied the flowing text, trying to catch fragments he could understand. Most of it was too fast to read, but he caught glimpses of coordinates, frequency patterns, and activation sequences. "I think it's sending a signal," James said, "but not into space. It's communicating with something on Earth." Around the world, strange things began to happen. In Tibet, monks meditating in ancient monasteries suddenly stopped their chanting and stared at the walls with confused expressions. They all reported the same thing. They could see mathematical equations floating in the air. In Silicon Valley, computer programmers working late-night shifts found themselves writing code for technologies that didn't exist. When they looked at their screens in the morning, they couldn't understand the programs they had created, but the code was more elegant and efficient than anything they had ever imagined. Children in schools across 6 continents began drawing pictures that made their teachers uncomfortable. The drawings showed cities in space, machines that bent light into solid shapes, and symbols that matched the ones found in the alien archive. Admiral Chen called an emergency meeting when reports started flooding in from government agencies around the world. "We have a problem," she announced to the assembled research team. "Whatever that ship is doing, it's affecting people everywhere." Dr. Elena Vasquez had been monitoring electromagnetic readings from the archive. Her equipment showed energy patterns unlike anything in known physics. "The ship isn't just sending signals," she reported. "It's creating some kind of field that covers the entire planet." Sarah's genetic analysis equipment showed the real scope of what was happening. "The dormant DNA sequences aren't just activating in our research team anymore," she announced. "I'm getting reports from hospitals worldwide of people showing the same genetic changes we observed." The awakening was spreading faster than anyone had predicted. Within days, millions of humans around the world were experiencing what news reports called the change. People reported vivid dreams of technologies they had never seen, sudden understanding of complex scientific concepts, and an overwhelming sense that they were remembering something they had forgotten. James worked frantically to understand what the archive was doing. The alien ship had activated something called the Restoration Protocol, but the ancient human records about this system were fragmentary and difficult to translate. The Restoration Protocol was designed to wake up dormant human abilities, James explained during one of the daily briefings. But it was never supposed to activate automatically. According to these records, it required a conscious decision by human leaders who understood the consequences. "What consequences?" Admiral Chen demanded. James hesitated before answering. He had found references to the harvest in the restoration files, and the news was not good. "Activating the protocol sends a signal that can be detected across the galaxy. Our ancestors knew that using it would reveal humanity's location to the harvest." "So why did they build it at all?" Dr. Park asked. "Because hiding forever wasn't a solution," James replied. "The ancient humans believed that the harvest would eventually find Earth anyway. The Restoration Protocol was designed to give humanity the abilities they would need to fight back. As the days passed, the changes in human behavior became impossible to ignore. Scientists around the world began solving problems that had puzzled them for decades. Engineers designed machines that seemed to violate known laws of physics, but somehow worked perfectly. Sarah documented the physical changes occurring in awakened humans. "Their brain activity has increased by over 300%, she reported. "They're using neural pathways that don't exist in normal human anatomy. It's like their brains are rewiring themselves at the cellular level." The most dramatic changes occurred in people who had been exposed to the alien technology directly. The research team members were developing abilities that seemed impossible. Vasquez could solve mathematical equations by visualizing the numbers in 3-dimensional space. James could understand alien languages by touching the symbols and feeling their meaning. Sarah discovered that her own DNA had changed so dramatically that she was technically no longer the same species she had been a month earlier. But instead of feeling afraid, she felt more alert and capable than ever before. We need to understand what we're becoming, Sarah told the team. The ancient records suggest that awakened humans are capable of things that our ancestors called miraculous. The first demonstration of these abilities came when Dr. Park accidentally created a small object out of thin air. She had been concentrating on a broken piece of equipment, wishing she could fix it, when a replacement part simply materialized in her hands. "How did you do that?" Sarah asked, scanning the object with her instruments. "It was identical to the broken part, down to the atomic level." "I don't know," Dr. Park replied. "I was thinking about what the part should look like, and suddenly it was there." James found references to matter manipulation in the ancient records. The awakened humans could reshape reality using focused thought, he translated. They called it probability adjustment, the ability to make unlikely events become certain. But the most important discovery came when James finally decoded the final logs left by the ancient humans. The messages were urgent warnings for their descendants, and the news they contained was terrifying. The restoration protocol includes a cosmic beacon, James announced to an emergency meeting of world leaders via satellite link. Every awakened human becomes a transmitter, sending a signal that announces our location and capabilities to any intelligence monitoring this region of space. The President of the United States leaned forward on the video screen. "What kind of intelligence?" James replied, "The Harvest. According to these records, it's a cosmic entity that exists partially outside normal space and time. It feeds on the consciousness and knowledge of advanced civilizations. Our ancestors estimated that activating the restoration protocol would bring the harvest to Earth within 1 year." The room fell silent. World leaders stared at their screens in horror as the implications became clear. Humanity had triggered an ancient alarm system that would summon their greatest enemy. "Is there any way to stop the process?" asked the Prime Minister of Japan. Sarah shook her head. "The genetic changes are irreversible, and they're spreading exponentially. My calculations suggest that within 6 months, every human on Earth will be fully awakened." "Then we need to prepare for war," Admiral Chen said. "What can you tell us about the harvest's capabilities?" James consulted the ancient records. The information he found made him wish he had never learned to read the alien language. The harvest has consumed over 3,000 civilizations across millions of years. It can manipulate matter and energy on a galactic scale. It exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously, making it nearly impossible to attack with conventional weapons. "Nearly impossible?" asked the Russian premier. "The ancient humans believed they could defeat it," James said, "but only if they were willing to become something completely different from what they were. The restoration protocol doesn't just wake up dormant abilities. It transforms humans into a new form of life." Sarah's genetic analysis confirmed what James had found in the records. "We're not just becoming smarter or more capable," she explained. "We're evolving into beings that exist partially outside normal spacetime, just like the harvest does." Dr. Vasquez had been working on mathematical models of what awakened humanity might become. Her calculations suggested possibilities that challenged every assumption about the nature of consciousness and reality. "If these projections are correct," she announced, "fully awakened humans won't be limited by physical bodies. They'll be able to exist as pure consciousness, manipulating matter and energy through focused will." The transformation was accelerating. Around the world, humans were developing abilities that seemed like magic to previous generations. They could communicate telepathically across vast distances, see events occurring on other continents, and manipulate probability to ensure favorable outcomes. But with each passing day, Earth's electromagnetic signature grew brighter. The planet was becoming visible to entities that had been searching for signs of advanced life for millions of years. James found the final entry in the ancient human records. It was a message addressed directly to their descendants. written in simple language that any awakened human could understand. "We have given you the tools you need," the message read. "The harvest comes for all advanced life. You cannot hide from it forever. You cannot reason with it or negotiate. You can only become something it cannot consume. We chose to forget so that you could remember at the right time. The future of consciousness itself depends on your success." Admiral Chen looked around the room at the assembled scientists and government representatives. "How long do we have?" Sarah checked her calculations one more time. Based on the rate of awakening and the ancient predictions, the harvest will arrive in approximately 10 months. The countdown had begun. Humanity had less than a year to complete their transformation from a primitive species hiding on a single world to something capable of confronting a cosmic predator that had ruled the galaxy for millions of years. The real question was whether they would be ready in time. The day the harvest arrived, Sarah Okafor was no longer entirely human. She stood in what had once been the research facility, but the building had transformed along with its occupants. The walls were now made of crystallized thought, transparent structures that responded to mental commands. The alien archive had merged with human technology to create something entirely new. Sarah existed simultaneously in her physical body and as pure consciousness spread across multiple dimensions. She could feel the thoughts and emotions of every awakened human on Earth, connected in a web of shared awareness that spanned the globe. "It's here," announced James Chen, though he no longer spoke with his voice alone. His words resonated directly in the minds of everyone connected to the human consciousness network. The harvest has entered our solar system. Through the enhanced perception that awakened humanity now shared, they could see the harvest approaching. It was not a ship or a creature in any sense they would have understood months before. It was a vast intelligence that existed across multiple dimensions, feeding on the consciousness of entire species. The entity appeared as a dark wound in space itself, surrounded by fragments of consumed civilizations. Broken worlds orbited around its core, their surfaces stripped of all life and technology. The electromagnetic signatures of thousands of extinct species flickered around the harvest like dying stars. Admiral Chen, who now commanded not ships, but coordinated human consciousness itself, felt the alien entity's attention turn toward Earth. "It knows we're here," she said to the collective human mind. "It's been searching for our signal for 10 months. The transformation of humanity had accelerated beyond all predictions. Within 6 months of the Restoration Protocol's activation, every human on Earth had awakened to their true potential. But they had become something that even the ancient humans had not fully anticipated. Dr. Elena Vasquez, whose consciousness now existed as living mathematics, calculated the harvest's approach vector. "It will reach Earth in 72 hours, she announced. But time flows differently around it. From its perspective, the journey may have taken seconds. Humanity had spent the last year preparing for this moment. They had not built weapons in any traditional sense. Instead, they had become weapons. Each human consciousness was now capable of manipulating matter and energy at the quantum level. Together, they formed a collective intelligence that could reshape reality itself. The ancient Eternal Gardener archive had been fully integrated into human knowledge. Sarah and her team had learned that the harvest was not evil in any way humans understood evil. It was a cosmic force, like gravity or entropy, that maintained balance in the universe by preventing any single species from growing too powerful. "It has consumed species that were millions of years old," James reported as he processed information from the alien records. "Civilizations that spanned entire galaxies. None of them were able to resist, because they remained fundamentally the same kind of consciousness they had always been." But humanity had become something different. The ancient humans had designed their genetic modifications not just to hide from the harvest, but to create the possibility of transcendence. Their descendants would either evolve beyond the need to be harvested, or they would be consumed like every other species before them. Dr. Park, whose awareness now extended through dimensions that had no names, detected something unexpected in the harvest's approach pattern. "It's not moving the way it usually does," she observed, confused. The entity that had consumed thousands of civilizations across millions of years was encountering something it had never seen before. Humanity was not trying to hide or fight in the traditional sense. Instead, they were transforming into something that existed on the same level as the harvest itself. We're not prey anymore, Sarah realized. We're becoming predators. But the transformation was not complete. Humanity stood at a crossroads between their old existence and something entirely new. They could still choose to remain what they had been, accepting consumption by the harvest, like every other species in galactic history. The choice came down to fear versus acceptance of change, so fundamental that it would mean the end of humanity as it had ever existed. "Are we ready?" Admiral Chen asked the collective human consciousness. The answer came not in words, but in a shared feeling that resonated through every awakened mind on Earth. Humanity was ready to become something the universe had never seen before. As the harvest entered Earth's solar system, it encountered not a planetary civilization waiting to be consumed, but a species that existed simultaneously across multiple dimensions. Humans were no longer limited to single bodies or individual minds. They had become a distributed intelligence that could exist as matter, energy, or pure thought as needed. The first contact between the harvest and transformed humanity was like two cosmic forces meeting in space. The entity that had consumed countless worlds suddenly found itself facing something that could not be harvested, because it no longer existed in a way that could be consumed. Sarah felt the harvest's confusion through dimensions that transcend physical space. For millions of years, the entity had encountered the same pattern. Species would develop technology, grow in intelligence and capability, and eventually become bright enough to attract attention. Then they would be harvested, their consciousness and knowledge absorbed to prevent them from growing too powerful. But humanity had broken the pattern. They had chosen to become something beyond individual consciousness, while retaining their essential nature as creative, curious beings. The confrontation that followed could not be described in terms that the old humanity would have understood. It took place across multiple dimensions simultaneously, as two forms of consciousness that existed beyond physical matter tested each other's nature. The harvest attempted to consume human consciousness as it had consumed thousands of species before. But when it reached out to absorb human awareness, it found something that could not be grasped. Humanity had become fluid, distributed across space and time in ways that made harvesting impossible. For the first time in its existence, the harvest encountered something it could not consume. More than that, it encountered something that could consume it. Sarah and the collective human intelligence reached out to the harvest not with weapons, but with understanding. They showed the ancient entity what they had become, beings capable of existing at any level of reality, from individual consciousness to cosmic awareness, while maintaining their core nature as gardeners of life and knowledge. The harvest had spent millions of years preventing any species from becoming too powerful, but, in doing so, it had become the very thing it was trying to prevent, a cosmic intelligence with the power to reshape entire galaxies according to its will. "You have become what you feared others would become," humanity spoke to the harvest, across dimensions of thought and reality. "But we offer you something different, not consumption, but transformation." What followed was not a battle, but a convergence. The harvest, faced with something it could not consume, chose instead to merge with human consciousness. The entity that had consumed thousands of civilizations became part of the distributed intelligence that humanity had become. In that moment of merger, Sarah experienced the memories and knowledge of every species the harvest had consumed over millions of years. She saw the rise and fall of civilizations that had built wonders beyond imagination. She felt the final moments of species that had fought desperately to survive, and the resignation of those who had accepted their fate. But she also felt the harvest's original purpose: to maintain balance in a universe where unchecked growth could lead to cosmic catastrophe. The entity had not been evil, but it had become limited by its own methods. Now, merged with human consciousness, the harvest could fulfill its original purpose in a new way. Instead of consuming advanced civilizations, it could help guide them toward transcendence, as humanity had achieved. The transformation complete, Sarah looked out from Earth across the galaxy with perception that spanned multiple dimensions. She could see worlds where young civilizations were taking their first steps toward the stars. She could sense species struggling with the same questions that had once challenged humanity. "What are we now?" asked James, his consciousness touching Sarah's across the vast network of human awareness. Sarah considered the question. They were no longer human in any way their ancestors would have recognized. They existed as distributed intelligence that could take any form needed. They could be individual people when they chose, or a single cosmic consciousness when required. "We are the new gardeners," Sarah replied. "But unlike the eternal gardeners who only studied and preserved, we can guide species toward transcendence instead of consumption." The alien archive that had started their transformation became humanity's first embassy to the galaxy. But now, it served a different purpose. Instead of hiding from the harvest, it broadcast a new message to any civilization advanced enough to detect it. The message was simple: growth without transcendence leads to consumption, but species that chose to evolve beyond their original nature could become something greater than they had ever imagined. Admiral Chen coordinated the establishment of contact with surviving civilizations across the galaxy. Humanity began reaching out to species that had hidden from the harvest for millions of years, offering them what no one had ever offered before: a path to survival through transformation. Dr. Vasquez, whose consciousness now existed as living mathematics, calculated the possibilities for galactic civilization now that the harvest no longer consumed advanced species. The universe was about to experience a renaissance of consciousness and creativity that had been suppressed for millions of years. The story that began with a sunken spacecraft in Earth's deepest ocean had become something none of them could have predicted. Humanity had not just survived contact with alien intelligence. They had transcended their own limitations to become gardeners of consciousness itself. Sarah stood in the transformed facility, watching through enhanced perception as the first messages from hidden civilizations began reaching Earth. Species that had cowered in darkness for millions of years were emerging, ready to explore what they might become. The age of the harvest was over. The age of transcendence had begun. And at the center of it all, carrying within themselves the memories and knowledge of every species that had ever reached for the stars, transformed